A valid contract requires a mutual exchange of something of value between both parties. This is known as consideration. In Curry v. Misa, the court established that a valuable consideration can be either a benefit to one party or a detriment to the other. For example, a person agrees to sell their car for 10,000 naira, benefiting the buyer by acquiring the car and the seller by receiving the money. Alternatively, a person agrees to paint a house for a given sum of money, the detriment will be the time used in painting the house. The plaintiff must show that either they benefited the defendant or suffered a loss because of something the defendant asked them to do. A contract must be supported by sufficient consideration, but the consideration need not be adequate. This means that it must not be proportional to what is given by the other party. Consideration must flow from the promisee. Only the person who has promised something of value can enforce a contract. A contract usually involves promises from both sides. If only one person makes a promise, it's not a contract unless it's a special kind of agreement. In A. Cardoso v. The executors of the late J. Doherty, Cardoso mortgaged his property to Doherty for loans. After failing to repay, Doherty took ownership and sold the properties. Doherty promised Cardoso could stay in one property until his death, a promise repeated by Doherty's executors. When the executors tried to sell the property, Cardoso sought to live there for life and stop the sale. The court refused, finding Cardoso had not provided anything of value in exchange for the promise. Past consideration. A promise to do something in exchange for something you've already done isn't a valid contract. In Re McCardle, a wife spent money on improvements to a house she shared with her husband. The other children agreed to pay her for the expenses, but the court ruled that this agreement was unenforceable because it was based on past consideration. Sufficiency of consideration. Consideration must be definite and meaningful to be valid. A consideration will be considered sufficient under the law if it is what the other party has requested in exchange for a promise. Performance of an existing duty. A pre-existing duty may come in one of three forms. Duty imposed by law. Duty imposed by contract with the promisor. Duty imposed by contract with a third party. Duty imposed by law. A promise to do something that one is already legally obligated to do is generally not valid consideration. Such a promise could violate public policy, as it might encourage public officials to demand bribes for performing their duties. In Collins v. Godefroy, a defendant promised to pay a plaintiff for lost wages due to testifying in court. The court ruled that this promise was unenforceable because the plaintiff was already legally obligated to testify. However, if the plaintiff had performed more than was required by law, it could have been sufficient consideration. Duty imposed by contract with a third party. If someone promises to pay you to do something you're already obligated to do under another contract, you can use that promise as consideration for a new contract with them. See Shadwell v. Shadwell. Duty imposed by contract with the promisor. If a party is already obligated under a contract, performing that obligation is not sufficient consideration for a new promise. This was demonstrated in Stilk v. Myrick, where a captain's promise of extra pay to seamen who remained on board after others deserted was unenforceable due to their pre-existing duty. In our next class we will discuss capacity.